Our first scripture reading this morning comes from the Old Testament book of Psalms, number 10, verses 2 through 3 and 6 through 11. Please join me in this responsive reading. Sinners hound the poor with no remorse,
but get tangled in their own schemes.
The wicked boast about their desires.
Greedy for profit, they curse the Lord.
Their mouths breed curses, lies, and violence.
Trouble and deceit lie under their tongues.
They wait in ambush near towns from their hideouts.
They watch for the helpless and murder the innocent.
They lurk as a lion, waiting in a thicket to carry off the poor.
They snare them in traps.
They crouch to the ground, then pounce on their prey.
They think, God forgets, never looks, never sees.
Our second scripture reading this morning is an epistle lesson from the first letter of John, chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. For those who would like to read along, this can be found in the New Testament of your pew Bibles on pages 225 and 226. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And all who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. Everyone who commits sin is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that he was revealed to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has either seen him or known him. Little children, let no one deceive you. Everyone who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. Here ends the reading of the lessons for today.
I invite you to be with me in prayer. Holy God, from the very beginning, you have been calling us to discover your kingdom of peace, to know your love, to reflect your way. Help us this morning to see ourselves as we really are, and to imagine what we still can become in the Spirit of Jesus. Amen. Some of you recall the late great actor Jimmy Stewart. If you don't know him from any other role in life, you know him as George Bailey in Frank Capra's classic Christmas film, It's a Wonderful Life. But actually, Jimmy Stewart's career spanned a half a century, over 50 years. And he appeared in almost 100 major motion pictures. Incredible films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Harvey, remember the rabbit? Vertigo, it's one of those Hitchcock ones. He did a whole string of Hitchcock films, collaborated with him. There was the Glenn Miller story, The Spirit of St. Louis, the Philadelphia story. He won an Oscar for that one. And the list goes on and on. And just when you think that you've reached the end, you say, oh my gosh, he was in that too. He was in that. Well, one of his lesser known films is a little film called Fire Creek. Maybe you've seen it somewhere along the way. Jimmy Stewart plays a poor farmer by the name of Johnny Cobb, who lives just outside a small little town called Fire Creek. It's a dusty little town. It's so small, it can barely have a main street. Johnny Cobb has a daughter. She's in her late teens. He has a couple of sons. They're about 10 and 12. And his wife, Henrietta, she is pregnant, and she is just about ready to deliver her child. Now, it also happens that Johnny Cobb has been declared by the people of Fire Creek as their part-time sheriff. It's more of an honorary thing. That's what Johnny likes to say. He's paid $2 a month. He wears a homemade badge that was made by one of his sons. It spells sheriff, S-H-E-R-A-F. but he's proud of that. His jail is little more than a wooden shed with a few bars on the window. And the toughest thing that Johnny has to deal with, and even that on only a very rare occasion, is someone on a Saturday night becoming a little too happy because they've been drinking a little too much. But one day, 5 outlaws ride into Fire Creek. They are led by a man by the name of Larkin, who's played by Henry Fonda. They are dodging a posse. Larkin has been wounded, and he's seeking to find respite to recover from his wound. And these 5 men who ride into town, they see Fire Creek not only as a safe place, but they see the town and its citizens as something there for their selfish use and their convenience. The outlaws are brutal. They're cruel. They bring with them mayhem and chaos and the destruction of all that is good and right. They are lawless. And it will fall to the part-time Sheriff Johnny Cobb with his homemade badge and his shaking hand to stand for what is right and true and ultimately protect and maintain the peace. Well, the John who gave us our reading this morning that Terry shared just a few moments ago in that general letter that we call 1 John, that John lived a long time before there were ever motion pictures. So he didn't know about Jimmy Stewart, and he never heard about Fire Creek. But when he's trying to tell us what it means to live as a child of God, and what it means when we don't, the imagery of Fire Creek may have been very close to what he actually had in mind. This morning we hear him in those few words that Terry read for us. We hear John talk about sin. Everyone who commits sin, John writes, is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. As I reflected on that passage this past week, I couldn't help think what a curious phrase that is. Sin is lawlessness. Sin, of course, is something we talk a lot about in the church, and a lot of times people just cringe when we talk about it. But much of the time when we talk about it relationally, existentially, as a turning away from God, as a missing the mark with our lives, which is to say, when we sin, we're not paying attention to God. We're looking out into the darkness, believing that we can find our own way. John says to us this morning, all of that is well and good, but there's another way of talking about this thing we call sin. We can see sin in terms of life order and life structure. There is a lawlessness to sin. There is a lack of structure. There is a lack of order that comes with it. The sinful life is a life when we live as a law unto ourselves. And so the lawlessness that John talks about, it is a lawlessness of the human heart. It is a lawlessness of the spirit. We live as though there is no other way, no better way that God could have imagined for us to live than the one we figure out when we stare out into the darkness. While all of this can be traced back to the individual, you and I know that it is insidious. It's infectious, contagious. It can creep into our best relationships. It creeps into our families at times. It can and does creep into our communities and the life that we share together. And what does it bring along with it? It brings along with it that capacity for mayhem and chaos and the destruction of all that we hold dear and good and true. And we can become numb to its presence because it is so prevalent. And so we are hardly surprised to see someone beaten by 2 assailants on the Metrolink. or to learn of the minister who has defrauded his congregation of hundreds of thousands of dollars, or to read of teachers who are being sent to prison because they are fudging results on standardized exams given to students. The lawless mayhem of the nightly news. It is so prevalent that it almost seems to us to be a given for the world. But this morning, John, in his letter, this general letter that goes out to the church, says there's a new sheriff in town. His badge is one of a thorny crown and nail-scarred hands. His sidearm is not a Colt 6-shooter, but it is truth about God and truth about God's way, how God would want us to live in the world. And this one stands triumphantly over and against the forces of chaos and mayhem and destruction, which is to say to all of us when we boil it all down, Jesus is the bearer of and the keeper of God's peace. And John calls him the pure one. Now, by pure, John's not talking so much about perfection, as he's talking about accurately reflecting the virtue of God, that which is in the very heart of God, the character of God. It's measured in our ability to love our neighbor. It's measured in the capacity to be kind and gentle and thoughtful and generous, doing no one evil for evil, as Paul used to like to say. Purity reflects God. Purity draws us closer to the humanity that God imagined could be ours, that goes all the way back to the story of Eden. God imagines how we can be in the world. Purity draws us closer to that. Purity ultimately creates, restores, maintains peace. Jesus is God's peacemaker. Jesus is God's peacekeeper. Jesus is God's sheriff. Well, if he is, what does that make you and me? Deputies, right? Makes us deputies. So what is the role of the deputy? I'd ask you this, Dave, right? What's the role of the deputy? The deputy supports the sheriff. There's a problem if he doesn't, or she doesn't. The deputy steps in when the sheriff isn't present. The deputy stands for the very same thing for which the sheriff stands. And so the deputy is also the bearer and the keeper of peace. And when the deputy is present, it is as if the sheriff were right there himself. So in the case of us, as the deputies of Jesus, we are his living presence in the world, standing against all of the ways that run counter to God's ways. This past week, we have all heard the story about Dan Price. He's the CEO for a company called Gravity Payments. And he decided to cut his salary by $1 million a year. In light of rising costs in the Seattle area for those who work for him, he has also decided to raise the minimum salary for his 120 employees to $70,000 a year, which is like, wow, for us here in the Midwest. And that's also the salary that he's going to take for himself. And for Dan Price, it's an issue of economic justice. In an article written for the New York Times this past Monday, Patricia Cohen wrote these words. She said, "Mr. Price's small privately owned company is by no means a bellwether, but his unusual proposal does speak to an economic issue that has captured national attention: the disparity between the soaring pay of chief executives and that of their employees." And she goes on to say, the United States has one of the world's largest pay gaps, with chief executives earning nearly 300 times what the average worker makes, according to some economists' estimates. And she goes on to say this. She says, that is much higher than the 20-to-1 ratio recommended by Gilded Age magnates like J.P. Morgan and the 20th century management visionary Peter Drucker. And Cohen finally quotes Dan Price as saying this. He says, the market rate for me as a CEO compared to a regular person is ridiculous. It's absurd. I think Jesus would have liked Dan Price. I think Jesus does like Dan Price. Not because Dan Price is perfect. Don't know anything more about him than this one issue. But because his heart, at least on this one issue, which affects so many people so deeply, it seems to reflect God's heart. It's what John calls purity. It's about reflecting the way of God to the world around us. And it's what the sheriff and his deputies do. Amen.